My name is Evelyn Hartley. I am 42 years old, and I work as a quiet cultural liaison in a company that rarely notices my existence. Yet on the night my life cracked open, I was not in an office or a meeting room. I was sitting at a polished restaurant table, invited by my husband to what he said was the most important business dinner of his entire career. He said a Japanese client needed to be impressed, and that my presence would make everything look polished. What he wanted from me was simple. Smile, drink water, do not speak, pretend I understood nothing. I remember thinking that this request sounded almost harmless, almost reasonable. But later, when the truth unfolded, I would understand that this was the first sign of how deeply I had disappeared inside my own marriage. So I did exactly what he asked. I sat beside him with perfect posture. I folded my hands gently in my lap. I lowered my gaze the way he preferred. I played the role he assigned to me, the silent wife who blended into the furniture. But the truth he never imagined was this. For nearly 2 years, during the nights he never came home, I had been learning Japanese in secret. I learned it because I needed something to remind me that I was alive. I learned it because I began to fear that if I did not claim at least one corner of my life for myself, I would vanish entirely. And that night, as the room filled with the soft clinking of glassware, I understood every word exchanged across the table. Halfway through the meal, my husband Adrian leaned closer to the client. He laughed, a soft and polished laugh that he had perfected over the years. His voice lowered slightly, as if letting the man in on a private joke. Then he said the sentence that split through me like ice. He said, in Japanese, that his wife was nothing more than decoration. He said that at home I contributed nothing of value. He said that his career would be exactly the same with or without me sitting beside him. At that moment, something inside my chest tightened so sharply that I wondered if I had forgotten how to breathe. It was not the insult that hurt. I had lived through insults before. I had survived years of careful, quiet dismissal. No. What broke something open inside me was the sound of conviction in his voice. He believed what he said, fully, easily, without hesitation. And he believed it in front of a client whose respect he wanted more than mine. I did not react. I did not look at him. I did not speak. Even though I understood every word, I simply sat still, completely still. The restaurant around me dimmed. The candles flickered in a cold way, as if the light itself was pulling away. It felt as though someone had opened a door inside my ribs and let all the air escape. My body stayed upright because my spine remembered how to hold me even when my heart did not. And in that silence, something irreversible happened. A part of me, the part that had spent 20 years supporting him, believing him, building a life around him, simply died. Not dramatically. Not loudly. It died like a light that quietly goes out in the corner of a house no one visits anymore. But another part of me woke up. It rose slowly, like a cold current under the surface of still water. It did not rise with anger or with noise. It rose with clarity. I looked at Adrian's profile as he spoke. He was confident, unaware, certain of his place in the world. And for the first time in my life, I saw him not as my husband, but as a man who had benefited for years from my silence. A man who mistook my gentleness for emptiness. A man who never imagined that I understood far more than I ever said. By the time dessert was served, I knew that my life would not continue the way it had. Something had shifted forever. And the shock of that realization was not frightening. It was steady. It was quiet. It was mine. Before I take you back through the years that led to this moment, I want to ask you something simple. If this story speaks to you, if you want to follow the journey of how a quiet woman learned to reclaim her voice, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps this channel bring more healing stories to life. Now let me take you to the moment before everything fell apart, the moment when I still believed silence was a form of love. When we left the restaurant that night, the cold evening air felt sharper than it should. It was as if my skin finally noticed every shift in temperature, every sound on the street, every small vibration of the world around me. Adrian walked a few steps ahead of me while talking on his phone. He did not notice that I was unusually quiet. He did not notice the weight in my breathing. He did not notice that something in me had shifted in a way that could never be undone. For 20 years, I had built my life around supporting him, smoothing the path beneath his feet, trimming the jagged edges of stress before they reached him. He used to call me the calm in his storm. Over time, I realized that I was the one weathering the storm so he could enjoy the calm. I was 42 years old when I understood how far I had drifted from myself. Before I married Adrian, I once dreamed of becoming a language teacher. I loved the structure of words, the way sentences turned into bridges that connected people. But when Adrian's career began to rise, I stepped aside willingly. I told myself that marriage meant partnership. That sacrifice was noble. I worked temporary jobs, kept the home steady and warm, handled the bills, the meals, the seasons of our life, so he could move freely through the world. I gave up the classroom I had imagined. I gave up the small apartment I once dreamed of filling with books. I gave up parts of myself without even noticing they were gone. The first years of our marriage were filled with tenderness. We were young, we were hopeful, but slowly, almost invisibly, the tenderness thinned. It dissolved like steam from a pot left unattended. I began to spend more evenings alone, waiting for him at the dinner table with plates growing cold. I remember the glow of the kitchen clock, the ticking that filled the silence, the way the empty chair beside me became a companion of its own. Adrian would text that he was stuck in meetings or networking events. I would tell him to take his time. I would wrap his plate and place it gently into the refrigerator. Then I would sit on the sofa with the lights dimmed, convincing myself that this was normal, that marriage required patience, that he was building something for us. Those nights became years, and the years became a quiet ache that never left. I learned to fold my loneliness into routine. My hands found comfort in the familiar rhythm of washing dishes, wiping counters, and preparing lunches for the next day. I told myself that stability was love. But deep down, something in me flickered restlessly. It was during one of those late evenings when the house felt too still that I opened a small notebook my mother once gave me. It had soft pages and a simple brown cover. I started writing Japanese words in it, one at a time, almost without thinking. It became my emotional anchor. Each new word felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself, a reminder that I could still learn, still grow, still breathe beyond the boundaries of my marriage. That notebook held more than vocabulary. It held the parts of me I had been keeping alive in secret. At work, no one really noticed me except for one person, a younger colleague named Maya Torres. She was bright and intuitive. She had a way of looking at people as if she felt the spaces between their words. One afternoon, after a meeting ended, she lingered beside me while everyone else left the room. She asked gently whether I was all right. I told her I was fine. I always said I was fine. She studied my face for a moment, then asked a question that stayed with me longer than she could have imagined. She said, "Do you ever feel like you are living someone else's life instead of your own?" The words struck me softly, but deeply. Her voice carried no judgment, only understanding. Maya was young, but she understood boundaries and self-worth in a way I never learned. She became a mirror I did not expect, reflecting a truth I had avoided for years. That night, after talking with her, I sat alone in my living room. The house was quiet except for the sound of distant traffic. I looked around and saw the same furniture, the same decorations, the same framed photos that once held so much meaning. Yet I felt untethered, as if the life around me belonged to a woman who had slowly faded into the background. As I opened my notebook and traced my fingers over the Japanese words I had written, I felt something shift again, subtle but unmistakable. It was the realization that I had been overlooked not just by Adrian, but also by myself. I had buried my own voice under years of silence. And now, for the first time in a long while, I could feel it rising. After the night of the business dinner, when my husband reduced me to a decorative object in front of a client, I sat awake long after he had fallen asleep. The house was silent, in the way only a long marriage can be silent, heavy and familiar, filled with echoes no one else can hear. I sat by the window with my notebook in my lap, the one where I kept every Japanese word I had learned. The pages were worn from being opened and closed so many times. That notebook was not part of my job. It was not a hobby I picked up to impress anyone. It was a promise, and it began many years before the cracks in my marriage became impossible to ignore. I learned Japanese because of my mother. She had been the quiet strength of my childhood, a woman who carried her own dreams in the small moments left over after caring for everyone else. When I was young, she used to tell me that words were keys, each one unlocking a different way of seeing the world. She believed languages expanded the borders of a person's life. She told me once, when I was still in school, that I should always learn something that made me feel alive. She said it in a soft voice while we were washing dishes together, her hands warm in the soapy water. She said, "Never forget to learn something that reminds you that you exist." When I was 24, I enrolled in an introductory Japanese class at a community center. I loved everything about it. I loved the shape of the characters, the rhythm of the sounds, the way a simple phrase felt like stepping into a culture with centuries of history and discipline. I wanted to become a language teacher one day. I imagined guiding students through the beauty of grammar, nuance, and cultural insight. I believed that understanding another language could teach people how to understand each other. It felt meaningful. It felt like mine. Then I met Adrian. At first, loving him felt easy. We were young. We were ambitious in different ways. He was building a business, determined to rise quickly. I admired his confidence. He admired my warmth. When we married, I believed that love meant building a future side by side. So when he asked if I could support him through the early years of his career, I agreed without hesitation. The Japanese classes were the first thing I let go of. I told myself I could always return to them when life settled. But life never settled. His schedule grew heavier. Our plans shifted toward his goals. Every time I thought about enrolling again, something would come up, something that required me to step in and stabilize our home. Slowly, almost invisibly, the promise I made to myself faded into the background. Then when I was 36, my mother died. Losing her felt like someone had taken the foundation of my life and shaken it until every piece cracked. She had been sick for a long time, yet nothing prepared me for the finality of her absence, and after the funeral, the house I grew up in felt hollow, as if the walls themselves had taken on the shape of her missing presence. In the months that followed, I moved through life quietly. I took care of practical matters, cooked meals, folded laundry, and tried to be steady for Adrian. But inside, I was adrift. One evening, while sorting through her belongings, I found a small envelope addressed to me. Inside it was a note she had written before she passed. Her handwriting was soft and curved, instantly recognizable. The message was only one sentence. It said, "Evelyn, do not forget to keep learning something that keeps your spirit alive." I sat on the edge of her bed, holding that note, feeling the weight of her love and her gentleness. It was not advice. It was a request from the woman who had spent her whole life giving everything she had. That night I searched online for beginner Japanese lessons. I did not tell Adrian. He had always dismissed my interests unless they were useful to him. When I once mentioned wanting to study again, he laughed lightly and said that hobbies were fine, as long as they did not interfere with more important responsibilities. More important in his mind always meant his schedule. He never asked about my dreams because he never imagined I had any that mattered. So I kept the lessons to myself. I studied late at night after finishing chores, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea while the house slept. It was the only hour of the day that belonged to me. Learning Japanese again did not feel like starting over. It felt like opening a door I had closed too early. The characters came back to me slowly, elegantly. The sounds of the language steadied me. Every new word I wrote in the notebook felt like stitching myself together after grief had torn something apart. I was not studying for work or for anyone else's approval. I was studying for her, for the memory of her voice telling me to stay alive inside my own life. The notebook became my second emotional anchor, the first being the memories of the dinners I once imagined we would share as a family, before silence became the language of my marriage. This notebook held my mother's presence. It held the version of me she always believed in, a woman who still had the capacity to grow even within the confines of a narrowing marriage. I never told Adrian why I studied late at night. If he noticed, he never asked. He assumed I was scrolling through my phone or planning something for the house. He never imagined I was nurturing a world he had no part in, and I hid the truth because I knew he would dismiss it, minimize it, or turn it into something trivial. I could not bear the thought of him reducing the last gift from my mother into something unimportant. The unspoken truth was this: I learned Japanese to keep my mother alive inside me. I learned it to keep myself alive. And the night I sat in that restaurant and heard my husband tear down my worth in a language he thought I did not understand, I realized that the promise my mother asked me to keep had become the very thing that would save me. The restaurant where everything broke open was one of those quiet, refined places that seemed to breathe in slow, deliberate rhythms. Soft amber lights glowed through paper lanterns shaped like floating moons. The scent of grilled fish and ginger drifted through the air. Gentle music played somewhere behind the wooden screens. Everything about the space felt intentional, balanced, almost sacred. I remember thinking it was the kind of room where truth could not hide. Even the sound of porcelain cups touching the table felt sharp and clear, like the beginning of a ceremony. Adrian walked beside me with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged everywhere. I followed him to the table where his client was already waiting. The man stood and bowed slightly. Adrian returned the gesture. I did the same with quiet respect. His name was Kenji Mori, a senior consultant from a Japanese firm. His expression was calm but alert, the way someone looks when they have learned to observe before they speak. When he sat down, his eyes flickered briefly toward me. It was not a judging look. It was a noticeable look, the kind someone gives when they are trying to understand what is not being said. The waiter poured tea. The steam curled gently upward. I kept my hands folded, my posture composed. Adrian began speaking quickly, switching between English and Japanese to impress his guest. I listened to every word while pretending I understood nothing. It was a strange feeling to sit silently within a language I had claimed for myself in secret. It felt like holding a candle beneath the table, letting its flame warm only my palms. At first, the conversation was about business strategy, upcoming negotiations, and market projections. Then, gradually, Adrian's tone shifted. His voice grew more casual, more self-assured. He leaned slightly toward Kenji, lowering his voice as though offering him an inside perspective. That was when he made the comment about me being a decoration. The words sliced through the air with such clarity that I felt the impact in my chest. My body stayed still, but something deep inside me recoiled. I kept my gaze lowered, my breathing controlled. I felt the weight of my silence pressing through me like a stone. What I did not expect was the way Kenji responded. He did not laugh. He did not smile politely the way many clients might in an awkward moment. Instead, he glanced at me for a brief second. His eyes sharpened. He noticed the slight shift in my posture, the stillness that was too still. He noticed because he was the kind of man who observed the undercurrents of a room. I held his gaze for only a moment before looking away, but that moment was enough. He saw that I had understood every word. Adrian did not see it. He continued speaking as though nothing meaningful had happened. He talked about how stressful his work was, how much responsibility he carried, how his entire household relied on him. He said this with a tone that implied I brought little to the structure of our life. Each sentence felt heavier than the one before. He painted himself as the sole provider, the man who held everything together. I listened to him rewrite our history, erasing my years of support, my sacrifices, my choices. I realized then how easy it was for him to view himself as the hero of our marriage. Then he mentioned a colleague named Cora, describing her as someone who understood the pressures of his work in a way I never could. He said her insight was refreshing, that she made the office environment easier for him. He did not say anything directly inappropriate, but the tone in his voice revealed more than he intended. Something tightened in my stomach. The signs I had been ignoring for months began to rearrange themselves into a shape I could no longer dismiss. Through all of this, I did not move. I did not interrupt. I did not ask for clarification. My silence was no longer obedience. It was resistance. It was an observation. It was the quiet gathering of truth. Every word he said etched itself into a part of me that was already beginning to rise and steady itself. I sensed Kenji watching me again, not in discomfort but in understanding. His gaze was respectful, measured. It carried a quiet acknowledgement, as if he recognized the power in my refusal to react. He seemed to understand that silence can speak in ways louder than confrontation. He did not intervene. Instead, he simply bore witness. As the dinner continued, I realized that my silence had become a shield, a mirror, and a decision. I was no longer the woman who tried to be invisible for the sake of peace. I was the woman who saw everything, heard everything, and was finally ready to hold every truth without looking away. By the time dessert arrived, the room felt different. Or maybe I did. The lantern light seemed sharper. The air felt cooler. And inside myself, something had settled with absolute clarity. I understood that this dinner was not a humiliation. It was a revelation. It was the moment the life I had been living cracked open to reveal the truth beneath it. And I knew that nothing that followed would ever be the same. The ride home after the dinner felt strangely suspended, as if time had shifted into a slower current that carried me without asking for my permission. Adrian walked ahead of me when we left the restaurant, still speaking into his phone about projections and deadlines. He opened the car door for himself first, not out of rudeness but out of habit. The kind of habit that forms when a man stops seeing the person beside him as someone who needs to be considered. When I sat down in the passenger seat, he did not look at me. He adjusted the rear-view mirror, cleared his throat, and began talking again about the contract he hoped to secure. He did not notice that I had not spoken a single word since dessert. He did not notice the stillness in my shoulders or the way my hands rested too tightly on my lap. The silence that pressed against my ribs felt heavier than anything I had carried in years. It was not a silence I used to keep peace or avoid conflict. It was a silence that grew from truth, a silence that had weight, shape, intention. The city lights streaked across the windshield in long, pale lines as we drove. Each passing beam briefly illuminated Adrian's face, carving sharp angles of confidence and certainty. Then the next beam would fall across my face, revealing something entirely different. It felt like the lights were dividing us into two separate worlds. His world was defined by ambition and motion. My world was defined by awakening and stillness. He began talking about the next phase of negotiations. He said he could tell that Kenji respected him. He said the dinner had gone well. Then he added a comment about how exhausting it was to carry so much responsibility on his shoulders, how lucky he was that he did not have to worry about anything at home. He said this without malice, almost casually, as if describing the weather. But the sentence echoed inside me with a hollow ache. As he spoke, I watched his reflection in the window. I realized that the man I once admired had become someone I could no longer recognize. Or perhaps he had always been this person, and I had simply softened the edges until they no longer resembled the truth. My thoughts turned inward in a slow, steady spiral. Where have I been in this marriage? How did I disappear without noticing my own absence? The questions rose from somewhere deep, a place I had ignored for far too long. They did not come with anger. They came with clarity. They came with the kind of honesty that arrives when illusions finally dissolve. When Adrian finished speaking, he turned on the radio and hummed lightly to a song he liked. He never once asked how I felt about the dinner. When we reached home, he walked inside ahead of me, already tapping on his phone. He said he needed to review a document before bed. He did not look back to see if I followed. I stood in the entryway for a moment, letting the quiet house settle around me. The air felt still and cool. I could feel the pulse of my own heartbeat, steady and low, like a reminder that I was still here, even if I had forgotten to claim that truth. I went to the bedroom and changed into something soft and warm. Adrian was already in his office, his voice drifting faintly through the closed door as he took another call. I sat on the edge of the bed with my notebook in my hands. The brown cover felt familiar beneath my fingertips. I opened it slowly, letting the pages fall open to a word I had written months earlier. The characters were simple but powerful. Ren nai, endurance, patience. It was a word my teacher once said carried both a burden and a blessing. To endure was to survive. To be patient was to stay open to the future. I traced the characters with my thumb and felt something shift inside me again. A question rose from the quiet. How long have I endured without asking why? How many years have I mistaken patience for surrender? How much of myself have I allowed to fade in the name of harmony? For the first time since our marriage began, I felt the weight of those years pressing forward, asking to be acknowledged. I closed the notebook gently and placed it on the nightstand. The room was dark except for the small pool of light from the lamp. I sat there in the quiet and let the truth settle into my bones. Endurance is noble only when it preserves something worth holding. Tonight, I finally understood that enduring without purpose was not strength. It disappeared. And I had disappeared long enough. In the days that followed the dinner, I began noticing the small fractures in my life with a clarity I had never allowed myself to see before. It was as though the silence I carried home that night had turned into a beam of light, shining into corners I used to overlook. I moved through the house with the same routines as always, yet everything felt different. Each room held a memory I had stored away without examining its weight. And now, those memories began rising, asking to be acknowledged. One of the earliest memories came to me while I stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. It was the year I received an unexpected job offer. The position was at a cultural center, assisting with language programs and helping develop community outreach. It was the closest I had come to living the dream I once held, the dream of teaching and connecting people through language. I remember holding the offer letter in my hands, feeling a spark of hope, a kind of quiet joy. When I told Adrian about it, he paused only for a moment before shaking his head. He said the schedule would be too demanding. He said he did not want his wife leaving early or coming home late. He said it would disrupt the balance of our home. I had wanted to argue, but the words never reached my lips. I turned down the offer the next day. Adrian thanked me for understanding. I told myself it was the right choice. But as I look back now, I see it for what it was. Another piece of myself I set aside without receiving anything in return. Another memory surfaced later that same evening. I was folding laundry when my mind drifted back to the winter. Adrian's father became seriously ill. The hospital bills were overwhelming. Adrian was stressed, drowning in pressure from work and family obligations. He told me he did not know how they would afford everything. I listened quietly, then went to our bedroom and opened the small envelope where I kept my personal savings. It had taken years to save that money. I had planned to use it for classes, maybe even for a degree program someday. Instead, I walked into the living room and handed the envelope to Adrian. I told him it was for the hospital bills. He accepted it with relief, kissed my forehead, and said he would never forget what I had done. But weeks passed, then months, and the gesture faded into something unspoken. His gratitude became an assumption. It became another sacrifice that disappeared into the background of our marriage. I realized then that my life had been a series of quiet offerings. I had given parts of myself to keep the peace, to support his ambitions, to hold the structure of our family together. None of these choices were forced on me. I made them willingly, believing they were acts of love. But love does not require erasure, and I had allowed myself to be erased piece by piece. As I moved through the house, memories continued to rise. The nights I stayed up sewing buttons back onto his shirts because he needed them early the next morning. On the weekends, I canceled visits with friends because he preferred that I stay home. The holidays I spent managing gatherings so he could rest. None of these moments were dramatic. They were ordinary. But they carried the weight of a truth I had never spoken. I had spent 20 years building a life around him while forgetting to build a life within myself. And yet I did not feel weak as I revisited these memories. I felt something else, a steady strength I had never named. My sacrifices had not come from emptiness. They had come from loyalty, generosity, and resilience. These were not the traits of a fragile woman. They were the traits of a woman who had held an entire marriage on her shoulders without asking for acknowledgement. I saw now that I had not been invisible. I had been overshadowed. The silence I kept after the dinner was not born from fear. It was born from recognition. I was beginning to see myself clearly for the first time in years. I was not weak. I had never been weak. I was simply hidden beneath the layers of a life shaped around someone else's needs. That night, as I stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker against the pavement, I felt something shift inside me once more. The truth was no longer buried. It was a present. It was undeniable. And it was mine to hold. This time, I would not let it fade. The more I allowed myself to see the truth of my marriage, the more the world around me began revealing pieces I had ignored for far too long. It happened quietly, the way sunlight reveals dust when it shifts through a window. None of the discoveries were explosive on their own. They were small, almost unremarkable moments, yet each one carried the unmistakable weight of something that had been hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, while Adrian was showering after a long day at work, I went to place his dry cleaning receipt on his dresser. As I opened the top drawer, his wallet shifted slightly, and a folded slip of paper peeked out from the edge. Something about the crispness of the paper caught my attention. It was a restaurant receipt printed on heavy cream stock, the kind used by upscale establishments. The total made my breath pause for a moment. It was the kind of bill associated with anniversaries, celebrations, or special occasions. But the detail that struck me most was the signature line. Instead of a single name, there were two initials written in flowing pen strokes, A and C. I stared at the letters for several seconds, feeling a dull tightening in my chest. I had attended no such dinner. I had received no message about a meeting with clients, and I knew no business partners whose names began with C. The receipt felt like a quiet confession, the kind that does not speak loudly but instead waits patiently for someone to read it. I folded the paper back into his wallet exactly as I found it. My hands did not shake. My breath did not quicken. I simply noted what I had seen and closed the drawer. There was no need to confront him at that moment. I was beginning to understand that truth gathered itself over time. My silence was no longer submission. It was discipline. It was the act of allowing reality to reveal itself fully without pushing or forcing. A few days later, another piece fell into place. Adrian announced that he had to travel for a 2-day work trip. He said there was a conference out of town and that he would be staying at a hotel recommended by his company. He gave the explanation casually, with the polished confidence of someone who believed he could not be questioned. I nodded and wished him a productive trip. After he left, something inside me felt unsettled. Not in a panicked way, but in a quiet, intuitive way. Later that evening, I received a call from the hotel regarding a confirmation issue. They had dialed our home number instead of his mobile. The receptionist asked politely if Mr. Hartley still intended to check in as a single guest. I asked her to repeat the question. She said only one person was listed on the reservation, a single occupancy room. My mind held the words with steady clarity. When I hung up, I sat down and wrote the details in my notebook, not in the section with Japanese vocabulary, but in the blank pages at the back meant for personal notes. I wrote the date, the time, and what the hotel had confirmed. I realized I was documenting my own life, gathering evidence of a truth I had avoided for too long. The final confirmation came in the form of an email. Adrian had left his laptop open on the dining table when he stepped outside to take a call. It was not curiosity that made me look at the screen. It was instinct. A small notification had appeared in the corner. The subject line read, "Thank you." When I clicked it, the message was short. "Thanks for yesterday. Cora." There was no signature block, no body text beyond that single polite line. Yet the simplicity of it carried a deeper meaning. It felt familiar, as if designed for someone who did not need context. My breath remained steady. I did not slam the laptop shut. I did not cry. I simply read the message again, letting the truth land with deliberate weight. I closed the laptop quietly and placed my hands on the table. "Cora," The initial on the receipt, the colleague, Adrian praised at dinner, the woman whose name had been floating like a quiet shadow in the background. I did not confront him, not because I feared his response, but because confrontation requires the expectation of honesty. I expected nothing from him now. What I needed was clarity, not confession. What I needed was the full picture before deciding what to do with it. As each piece revealed itself, I felt neither rage nor despair. I felt something steadier, a kind of solemn dignity that came from finally seeing my life without filters. The audience of my memory began to shift. I was no longer telling myself stories to protect his choices. I was letting the truth speak without resistance. I carried myself through those days with quiet composure. I cooked dinner, I folded laundry, I responded to emails. But beneath the surface, I was taking notes, storing details, preparing for the moment when understanding would turn into action. Viewers may expect fury, but I did not burn. I settled. I centered myself. I allowed the truth to stand on its own 2 feet, because dignity remains even when trust collapses. And I was learning slowly that the woman who had been hidden for years was beginning to rise. In the weeks that followed my discoveries about Adrian, I moved through my days with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar. I was no longer drifting in the shadow of my marriage. I was observing it, studying it, tracing the shape of its cracks with precision. Yet even with all that I had uncovered, the shift happening inside me was slow, like a tide pulling away from the shore grain by grain. I had not yet reached the point where understanding turns into decision. I was simply learning to breathe with my eyes open. Work became a refuge of sorts. The office was ordinary, sometimes dull, but it was a space where my life was not defined by Adrian's expectations. I arrived early, kept to myself, and completed my tasks with quiet consistency. Most colleagues greeted me politely but lightly, as if they sensed my preference for gentle distance. Only one person seemed to notice me in a way that felt disarming. Maya Torres. She was 10 or 15 years younger than I was, with dark, expressive eyes and a quick mind that could slice through any pretense. She had a warmth that did not intrude, a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from knowing her worth. She moved through the office like someone who understood the world could be both beautiful and cruel, and that survival required clarity. I did not seek her company, yet somehow she kept appearing in the quiet margins of my days, offering small moments of connection. One afternoon, we both stayed late to finish a project. The office had emptied out, leaving only the soft hum of the air vents and the glow of desk lamps casting long shadows across the floor. Maya retrieved 2 cups of tea from the break room and placed one gently beside my keyboard. She did not ask whether I wanted it. She simply offered it, as if sensing I needed something warm to hold. She said she had been meaning to ask me something. Her voice carried a thoughtful hesitation, not wanting to cross a boundary. I nodded for her to continue. She told me about her mother, how her mother had spent years in a marriage where she was treated as an accessory, not a partner. How she had raised children, held a job, managed a household, and still felt unseen. She said her mother finally left after realizing she had been living a half-life. Not a wrong life, but a life trimmed down by someone else's expectations. When her mother walked away, she said it was the first time she saw her breathe freely. As Maya spoke, something in my chest tightened with recognition. I sipped the tea slowly, letting the warmth steady my hands. She did not know the details of my marriage. I had shared nothing. Yet everything she said seemed to land at the exact center of my quiet ache. She paused before sharing the part that would stay with me long afterward. She said that when her mother finally left, she asked her one simple question. It was the question that changed everything. Maya looked at me then, her voice soft but unwavering, and repeated the same words. She said, "Do you ever think you deserve a kinder life than the one you are living?" I felt the question settle in the room. It did not rush or demand. It simply existed with a kind of gentle weight that pressed against the truth inside me. I did not respond. My throat felt tight. as if words could not form without unraveling something I had spent years holding together. Instead, I looked down at the steam rising from my cup, watching it curl in delicate shapes. Maya did not push for an answer. She understood the question was not meant to be answered aloud. It was meant to echo. It was meant to find its own path through the quiet spaces of a woman's heart. She went back to her desk and continued working, leaving me alone with thoughts I could no longer avoid. Later, as I packed my things to leave, she touched my arm lightly. She said she knew what it felt like to carry a heaviness that no one else could see. She said I did not need to explain anything, but if I ever wanted someone to talk to, she was there. Not to solve anything, just to listen. It was the kind of offer that felt rare, the kind that came from sincerity rather than obligation. On the drive home that night, her question followed me like a quiet thread. Do you deserve a kinder life? The more I repeated it to myself, the more it began to shift something inside me. Not violently, not with anger, but with the slow and steady force of truth. I began remembering moments when I had accepted mistreatment as normal. The nights I had waited alone, the opportunities I had turned down, the sacrifices I had made. I realized that I had never once asked whether my life could be different, whether I had the right to ask for more, whether endurance had become a habit instead of a virtue. That question became a hinge in my thoughts. Everything before it felt muted. Everything after it felt sharp, defined. It did not make me confront Adrian. It did not make me pack my bags. But it opened a door inside me that I had kept locked for far too long. When I reached home, Adrian was already in bed. His breathing was steady, unbothered. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the man I had loved for 2 decades. I wondered when I had stopped being a partner in his eyes and become a fixture, a certainty, a background presence. I went to my side of the bed and opened my notebook once again. The word endurance waited on the page, but this time, as I looked at it, I felt something new forming beneath the surface. A quiet readiness, a slow shifting of ground, a voice that was still soft but no longer silent, and I knew that Maya's question had not just been a moment. It had been a turning point. Maya's question stayed with me, quiet but persistent, shaping the way I moved through the world in the weeks that followed. It did not push me into action. It simply sharpened my awareness. It was as if someone had cleaned a fogged window and I could finally see my life without distortion. And once I saw it clearly, I knew I needed guidance. Not emotional reassurance, not sympathy. I needed the truth spoken plainly by someone who understood the weight of silence. That was when I reached out to Clara Jennings, an old friend from college who had become a respected attorney. We had kept in touch loosely over the years, exchanging holiday messages and occasional updates. She had always been someone who spoke with integrity, someone who could hold compassion and logic in the same breath. When I called and asked if we could meet privately, she agreed without hesitation. We met at a quiet cafe near her office. The place was nearly empty, the soft clatter of dishes blending with the low murmur of conversation from a corner table. Clara studied my face for a long moment before speaking. She said I looked like someone carrying a burden she had not named yet. I took a breath and told her everything, not the emotional details, not the heartbreak, but the facts. The receipt with the initials, the hotel reservation, the email from Cora, the strange inconsistencies in Adrian's behavior. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression calm and alert. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said she believed the signs pointed to more than infidelity. She said there might also be financial misconduct, the kind that people hide in marriage because they assume their partner will never look closely. She explained that if Adrian was transferring assets, opening accounts, or moving funds without my knowledge, it could leave me vulnerable if things deteriorated. Further, her words did not shock me. They clarified something I had already sensed. Trust had eroded in ways deeper than the emotional distance I had grown used to. Clara asked if I wanted to investigate quietly. When I nodded, she outlined what I needed to do. She told me where to look, what documents mattered, how to make copies without leaving traces. She also advised me to open a personal bank account, something separate from our shared finances, to begin building a safety net. It was not a betrayal, it was self-preservation. That night, when I returned home, I felt a strange mix of steadiness and vulnerability. Adrian was in the living room watching television. He greeted me with his usual distracted warmth, unaware of the shift taking place beneath the surface. While he watched his show, I went to the bedroom and began the process Clara had instructed me to follow. I started by gathering small pieces: old tax returns, bank statements, credit card summaries. I photographed each document carefully, organizing them into folders on a secure drive Clara had recommended. It felt like reclaiming pieces of myself, one document at a time. I was learning the shape of a life I had not examined in years. It was sobering to see the patterns, the withdrawals I had not approved, the investments I knew nothing about. Clara was right. This was more than emotional neglect. It was a quiet restructuring of power. One evening, while Adrian showered, I opened his office drawer to copy a financial ledger he kept hidden beneath old invoices. As I lifted the book, I heard the water shut off suddenly. My heart tightened. Footsteps echoed down the hall. I closed the drawer, but not quickly enough. Adrian walked into the room just as I stepped away from the desk. He looked at me with mild surprise and asked what I was doing. I forced my breath to remain steady. I said I was looking for a pen to write a reminder. He paused for a moment, studying my face, and something in his expression shifted subtly. Suspicion or curiosity, I could not tell. After a beat, he nodded and walked past me to retrieve a towel. I left the room calmly, my hands trembling only when I reached the hallway. It was the closest I had come to being discovered, and the realization carried both fear and resolve. I could not stop now. The truth was too close to the surface. Over the next few weeks, I continued gathering information with quiet precision. Clara reviewed everything I sent her, confirming our suspicions. Adrian was transferring funds into an account under a secondary entity, a shell business registered in another state. He had never mentioned this business to me. The amount he was moving was not insignificant. It was enough to create a financial divide that could leave me with almost nothing if he chose to walk away. Yet even as the truth grew heavier, I did not crumble. I felt myself strengthening, sharpening. My silence was no longer passive. It had become strategic. I spoke to Adrian as I always had, calm and composed. I prepared meals. I maintained routines, but every action now carried awareness. I understood the dynamic of our marriage with a clarity that felt both painful and empowering. There was a moment toward the end of that month when I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and realized I no longer feared the truth. I no longer feared what I might find or what it might mean. Instead, I felt a rising steadiness. I was reclaiming my life inch by inch, and though Adrian did not sense the shift, I could feel it growing inside me with every step I took. I was no longer waiting for his behavior to change. I was preparing for my own transformation, and the power of that quiet resolve was sharper than anything I had felt in years. The deeper Clara and I went into Adrian's financial trail, the more unsettling the picture became. Each new document she reviewed added another layer of clarity, stripping away whatever remnants of denial I still carried. One evening, she called me after analyzing a set of bank statements I had scanned earlier that week. Her voice was steady, but I sensed the seriousness beneath it. She said Adrian was not only transferring money to a secondary account, he was quietly moving assets into someone else's name, a name I did not recognize, a woman. The registration papers listed her as a partner in a business Adrian had never mentioned to me. Clara explained that this kind of transfer was often used to shield assets from a spouse. She said that if I waited too long, there might be nothing left legally tied to our marriage. Hearing those words was like feeling the ground shift beneath me. I had suspected infidelity. I had suspected dishonesty. But this was something else. This was erased. Not emotional erasure, which I had lived with for years, but legal and financial erasure. He was preparing for freedom, freedom from marriage, freedom from responsibility, freedom from me. For days after that, I moved through the house with heightened awareness. Every drawer I opened, every cabinet I passed, every sound Adrian made in the next room felt sharper. I watched the subtleties of his behavior. He seemed lighter, almost buoyant at times, as if he were carrying a secret that gave him confidence. I wondered whether he believed the life he was crafting without me would be waiting once the transition was complete. Then came the moment that confirmed everything. I had returned home early from work one afternoon because of a power outage at the office. Adrian did not expect me. When I walked up the stairs toward our bedroom, I heard his voice through the slightly open door. It was not raised or tense. It was calm, relaxed, almost relieved. He was on the phone, pacing slowly across the room. I stopped midway up the staircase. Something in me knew not to move. He said he was close to being done. He said all the paperwork was nearly in order. And then, with a tone of satisfaction so clear it felt like a physical blow, he said, "Once I sign this final agreement, I will finally have my freedom. Freedom." The word echoed in the hallway with a coldness that made my fingers tighten on the banister. He did not say it with hesitation or regret. He said it as though he had been waiting years to claim it, and I knew with complete certainty that the freedom he envisioned did not include me, not as a partner, not as a companion, not even as an afterthought. I stood frozen, watching the light under the door flicker with his pacing. A part of me wanted to push the door open, confront him, demand the truth he had hidden so carefully. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger each day, told me to stay silent. Silence was no longer fear. Silence was strategy. Silence allowed me to hear the truth in his own words without altering the moment. When he ended the call, I stepped back quietly and went downstairs, pretending I had just arrived home. He greeted me with his usual distant warmth, unaware that I now carried knowledge that could shatter the foundation of our marriage. As he kissed my cheek, all I could think was how easily he had planned a future without me, how confidently he had spoken of freedom, how little space I occupied in the life he imagined. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind turned over the same question repeatedly, slow and steady, like a tide carving into stone. Should I protect this marriage, or should I protect myself? It was not a dramatic question. It was not asked with anger or despair. It was asked with clarity. Clara had warned me that if I did nothing, I would lose not only emotional ground, but legal and financial standing. Maya's words echoed again. Do you deserve a kinder life? And now the question deepened. Do I deserve safety? Do I deserve the truth? Do I deserve a life built on something more than endurance? For 20 years, I had believed that saving a marriage meant holding my breath through every difficulty, staying quiet through every disappointment, and absorbing every imbalance. But now, I saw the truth. I was the only one fighting for something Adrian had already abandoned long before the words left his mouth. As I looked at his sleeping silhouette beside me, the conflict inside me did not tear me apart. It clarified me. I understood that saving the marriage would mean sacrificing myself, and saving myself would mean acknowledging that the marriage was already broken. The next morning, I woke with a steadiness I had not felt in years. The question had been answered not with anger, but with certainty. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to protect the parts of me that were finally beginning to rise. The morning after hearing Adrian promise someone his freedom, I woke with a clarity so steady it felt almost physical. It was not anger that stirred me. It was not heartbreak, though sorrow rested quietly beneath the surface. What I felt was a kind of grounded knowing, a certainty that grew from every truth I had gathered. For 20 years, I had shaped my life around him. Now I understood that I needed to shape a future for myself. I moved through the house in deliberate silence. The air felt different, as if the rooms were holding their breath with me. I began gathering the items Clara told me to secure: birth certificates, financial statements, insurance documents, copies of tax returns, the small details that form the skeleton of a life. I collected them slowly, handling each page as if acknowledging the weight of what it represented. This was the life I had built, and now I needed to protect it. I placed everything into a plain folder, then slid the folder into my bag. Clara had arranged access to a secure legal safe at her office. She said it would protect my documents until the moment I decided how to move forward. I had not told her the latest truth I overheard. I did not need to. Once a woman hears a man speak of freedom without her, the rest becomes self-explanatory. When I stepped outside to leave for Clara's office, the sky was still gray with early light. The morning air carried a sharpness that made my breath come out in small clouds. As I walked to my car, I felt the subtle tremor of change inside me. Not fear, no hesitation. Change, it moved through my body like a quiet current guiding me forward. At Clara's building, she greeted me without questions. There was no need for explanations. She led me to the back offices where the legal safes were kept. I placed the folder inside, sliding it onto the shelf with hands that finally felt steady. When the door latched shut with a firm metallic click, something inside me settled. The truth was protected. My future, though uncertain, now had a place to stand. On the drive home, my thoughts moved slowly, gathering themselves into something cohesive. I realized that the decision I needed to make was not about Adrian. It was about me. For years, I had been shrinking around his choices. Now I needed to expand into my own. At home, I began packing the items that mattered. Not everything, just the essential things that belonged to me and me alone. A few clothes, my notebooks, my mother's letter, the Japanese textbook with worn edges, the teacup she gave me the year before she died. I moved through the bedroom with calm purpose. Every object I placed in the suitcase felt like reclaiming a part of myself. The house was quiet except for the steady sound of my breathing. At one point, I stopped and looked around the room. It held so many memories, yet none of them anchored me anymore. They felt like artifacts from a life that had ended without announcement. As I zipped the suitcase, I felt a stillness settle over me, a stillness not born of doubt, but of readiness. Then came the moment that would define everything. I sat on the edge of the bed and reached for my Japanese notebook. I opened it to the page I had written weeks earlier. The characters were simple, elegant, and deliberate. ZU freedom. The word felt different now. It was no longer theoretical. It was no longer a concept tied to language lessons or distant dreams. It was something I could feel in my hands, in my chest, in the air around me. I slipped my wedding ring from my finger. The motion was slow, almost tender, as if acknowledging the years woven into the small circle of metal. I placed the ring gently on the open page, right beside the character for freedom. It rested there with a kind of quiet finality. The contrast was striking, a symbol of a bond that had grown hollow lying next to a word that had begun to fill me with life. It was a moment suspended in time, a slow motion turning point where one chapter ended and another began before I even stood up. I closed the notebook with care, leaving the ring inside like an artifact of a story I no longer needed to carry. My hands did not shake. My breath did not waver. I felt calm, grounded, almost serene. This was not abandonment. This was an emergency. When I walked downstairs, the suitcase wheel clicked softly against the floor. Adrian's office door was closed. I could hear faint typing, the rhythm steady and predictable. He was working, building, planning a life that did not include me, and he had no idea that I had already stepped beyond the boundary of that future. I paused at the threshold of the front door. A small shaft of afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the hallway in a warm, gentle glow. I felt it on my skin like a quiet blessing. Then I stepped outside. The air greeted me with a clarity that made my lungs expand deeper than they had in years. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no slammed doors, no raised voices. I did not need to announce my departure. Some decisions speak for themselves. Some choices carry power simply because they are made in silence. As I walked toward my car, I felt the shape of my new beginning settling around me. It was not loud or triumphant. It was steady. It was deliberate. It was mine. I placed my suitcase in the trunk, closed it gently, and sat behind the wheel. For a long moment, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and allowed myself to breathe fully and completely. Then I started the engine and drove toward the life I had finally chosen. I did not look back. Serving Adrian the divorce papers was not a dramatic event. There were no raised voices, no shattered glass, no crowded room watching. Clara arranged for the documents to be delivered through the proper channels. I was staying in a small, rented apartment by then, a quiet space with bare walls and a window that let in more light than I was used to. When my phone rang and I saw his name, I already knew he had received them. His voice on the line was a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride. He asked if this was some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. I answered, calmly telling him there was no mistake. The silence that followed stretched tight. Then he asked to meet in person. Clara agreed we should do it in her office, neutral ground, a place where emotions would be contained by walls that had heard worse. When Adrian walked into Clara's conference room, he looked different, not outwardly. His suit was still sharp, his posture still straight, but his eyes carried something I had not seen before. It was not love or remorse. It was a shock that the version of me he had created in his mind no longer matched the woman sitting across from him. He picked up the stack of papers on the table as if they were something offensive. He flipped through them, barely skimming the content, and then looked at me with a mix of anger and confusion. He asked how I could do this after everything he had provided. He reminded me of the house, the lifestyle, the opportunities he believed he had given me. He spoke as if the marriage was a business transaction, and I was reneging on a contract. When that did not move me, he shifted tactics. His voice softened. He said things could still be fixed. He said he had been under pressure, that the transfers and secret accounts were just business strategy. He said the other woman meant nothing, that it was a distraction, a mistake, a phase he was already preparing to end. He reached for my hand across the table as if proximity could rewrite the years of distance. I did not pull away, but I did not reach back. He tried again. He spoke about our early years, the trips we took, the small apartment where we first lived. He tried to weave a nostalgic net around my resolve. He said we had built too much together to walk away now. He said marriage required endurance, forgiveness, and sacrifice. He spoke these words with conviction, as if he were lecturing a client about commitment rather than facing a woman he had spent years ignoring. Then came the emotional bargaining. He said he could not imagine his life without me. He said he depended on my calm, my stability, my presence. He said he would change. He would be more attentive, more present, more honest. He painted a picture of a future where everything would be different, where we would somehow begin again as if the past 2 decades had been a misunderstanding instead of a pattern. Through it all, I listened. My hands stayed folded in my lap. My breathing stayed slow and steady. I could feel Clara's quiet presence beside me, a grounding force in the room. Adrian's words floated between us, familiar yet hollow. There had been a time when I might have clung to them, desperate for reassurance. That time had passed. What struck me most was not what he said, but what he did not say. He did not ask when I first began to feel invisible. He did not ask how it felt to sit at that dinner hearing him dismiss my existence in a language he thought I did not understand. He did not ask about the nights I spent alone, the job offers I turned down, the savings I gave to his family. The man sitting across from me was fighting for his comfort, his image, his control. He was not fighting for me. When he realized his charm and arguments were not working, his tone hardened. He accused me of overreacting, of letting other people influence me. He implied that Clara had filled my head with worst-case scenarios. He suggested that maybe I had misunderstood the financial transfers, the business arrangements, the hotel booking. He insisted that his comment at the dinner was a joke, that I was too sensitive, that I always had been. I let him speak until his words began to circle back on themselves. Then I finally lifted my eyes fully to his. For the first time in a very long time, I did not see him through the lens of who I wished he could be. I saw him exactly as he was. My voice, when it came, was soft but clear. I said, "You never really saw me. Even now, you still think I do not understand anything." The sentence hung in the air between us, simple and final. It was the truth threaded through every year of our marriage. He had built an entire life on the assumption that I would not see, would not know, would not act. My silence had been his greatest asset. Now it was his mirror. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. For a brief moment, I watched something shift behind his eyes. Perhaps it was recognition. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was only the realization that the version of me he depended on was gone. Clara cleared her throat gently and redirected the conversation to practical matters. Timelines, asset division, legal boundaries. I answered her questions calmly. Adrian signed where he needed to sign, his hand moving with reluctant precision. The illusion of our marriage, the one I had carried for so long, finally fell quiet. It did not shatter. It simply stopped pretending to be something it never was. After the meeting, I stepped out into the crisp air and felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Not grief for the man I was leaving, but for the years I had abandoned myself. That evening, back in my small apartment, I made a cup of tea and opened my laptop to check emails. Among the usual messages was one with a subject line that made my breath catch for a moment, from Kenji Mori. I opened it. His message was thoughtful and concise. He wrote that he had heard about changes in Adrian's professional and personal life through business circles. He said he hoped I was well. Then he added something that reached directly into the memory of that night at the restaurant. He said he knew, from the way my eyes followed the conversation and the subtle reactions in my posture, that I understood Japanese. He wrote that he had respected my choice to remain silent, that it revealed a strength and composure he did not often see. At the end of his message, he told me his firm was expanding their work with international partners, and that they were looking for someone with cultural insight and language skills to act as a liaison and consultant. He asked if I would be interested in discussing a potential position. I sat back in my chair, letting the meaning of his words settle. The language I had learned in secret, the one I had clung to as a lifeline to my mother and to myself, was opening a door I had never expected. Not just to a job, but to a life where my skills and my presence were seen. For the first time in a long while, I felt something rise in me that was not endurance or resignation. It was possibility. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I opened my eyes to a morning filled with sunlight, the kind of warm light that spills gently across the floor before the world fully wakes. My new apartment was small but bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the sky like a soft watercolor painting. It was nothing like the house I once lived in. This space did not hold echoes of conversations unspoken or shadows of expectations unmet. It held only air, light, and possibility. I had moved here with a suitcase, a few boxes, and the notebook that had become the quiet anchor of my journey. Everything else I left behind willingly. I did not need objects to remind me of the years I had spent disappearing into the background of someone else's life. I needed room to breathe. I needed room to become. My life had shifted in ways I never imagined possible. After receiving Kenji's email, I met with him and his team. Their questions were thoughtful, their interest sincere. They did not ask about my marriage or my past. They asked about my insight, my perspective, my linguistic instincts. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen for my mind rather than my silence. Within months, I accepted a position as a cultural liaison and language consultant for their international projects. The work was demanding, layered with nuance and responsibility, but it awakened a part of me I feared had been lost. I rediscovered the joy of learning. I dusted off my grammar books, attended workshops, and began studying with a tutor who challenged me in the best way. Each lesson felt like a step toward a life my mother had once envisioned for me. Sometimes I imagined her sitting across from me, smiling with quiet pride. In those moments, I felt closer to her than I had in years. My relationship with Maya had grown into something steady and genuine. She became a constant in my life, a friend who understood the subtle complexity of rebuilding oneself after long silence. We met for coffee on weekends, exchanged book recommendations, and laughed in ways that made my chest feel lighter. She was younger, but her insight often exceeded her years. She reminded me that healing was not a straight line. Some days were strong, others were tender. Both mattered. One evening, after a long day at work, Maya visited my apartment. We shared dinner by the window, watching the city lights shimmer like a soft constellation below us. She asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a long time before answering. I told her I regretted the years I spent believing endurance was the same as love. But I did not regret leaving. I did not regret choosing myself. She nodded, understanding without commentary. She said I was living proof that quiet strength could become a force of transformation. As the months passed, I settled deeper into the rhythms of my new life. I learned how to cook meals for one without feeling lonely. I filled the apartment with plants that thrived in sunlight. I bought a small bookshelf and began collecting novels and poetry again. I walked to work when the weather was kind, letting the city's hum blend into a music of its own. With each passing day, my world expanded outward and inward at the same time. There were moments when memories of my marriage drifted back. Not with bitterness, not with longing, with clarity. I no longer looked at those years as wasted. I saw them as chapters that taught me resilience, devotion, and the dangers of shrinking oneself to fit another person's expectations. Those memories no longer held power over me. They had become quiet teachers. One Saturday morning, I opened my notebook, the same one that had carried me through so many turning points. Its pages were filled with vocabulary, reflections, and fragments of the life I was slowly rebuilding. I turned to the page where I had once placed my wedding ring beside the word for freedom. The ring was no longer there. It rested in Clara's safe, a symbol preserved only for legal necessity, not memory. I reached for a pen and turned to a clean page. The sunlight streamed across the table, illuminating the empty space before me. I wrote a new character, drawing each stroke with deliberate movement, Zai Sheng Rebirth. As I looked at the words, something inside me softened and expanded. It was not the triumphant rise of a phoenix or the dramatic transformation of a life shattered and rebuilt. It was something quieter, a renewal, a slow unfurling, a return to myself after years of forgetting who I was allowed to be. I closed the notebook gently and placed my hand on its cover. My breath settled into a calm rhythm. The apartment felt warm, safe, and alive. For the first time, I truly believed that healing was not a destination, but a way of living. It was in every choice I made, every boundary I held, every quiet morning I greeted with my own presence fully intact. Standing by the window, watching the city move below, I felt neither triumphant nor defeated. I felt whole. I felt present. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped into the shape of her own life. And as the light continued to rise, I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone else, I did not win against anyone. I simply found my way back to who I am, and sometimes that is the greatest victory a life can hold.